Good morning, or good afternoon, or evening, depending on where you may be, and welcome to the Council for a Parliament of the World's Religions webinar series. My name is Rick Ufford-Chase. I'm serving as the Executive Director of the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship here in the United States, and as co-director of Stony Point Center, a Presbyterian conference center in New York State that is home to a multi-faith community called the Community of Living Traditions. Following today's presentation, we'll have time to take questions from our listeners. At any point during the webinar, you may type questions into the box on the screen. We'll then sort through those questions and choose them as we can. I don't expect we'll be able to get to all of them. We'll take as many as we can before the end of our hour. Today's webinar, Changing the Conversation, Tools for Talking About Palestinian and Israeli Nonviolence Efforts in Your Community, features Ms. Ronit Avni. Ronit is an award-winning filmmaker, human rights advocate, and media strategist with an expertise in Israeli-Palestinian conflict resolution efforts. Ms. Avni is the founder and executive director of Just Vision, a nonprofit organization that researches, documents, and creates media about Palestinian and Israeli grassroots leaders in nonviolence and peace building. At Just Vision, she recently produced the documentary film Budrus, and directed and produced the film and Counterpoint. I would encourage all of you to take a look at their website at Just Vision and to see either or both of these films. On a personal note, I took my own children, who are younger teenagers, 13, 14, 15 years old, to see Budrus in the fall, and it was quite a moving experience. Welcome, Ronit, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rick, and thank you, everyone, for joining. It's really a delight to be with you this morning, my time. This is obviously a very complex topic, and we will touch upon some resources and some strategies that are available to those who are interested in facilitating and educating about the Israeli-Palestinian context through the lens of nonviolence initiatives, and hopefully we'll be able to get through as many questions as possible. So just a little bit of background so you have a sense of where I'm coming from in all of this. I work with a team of Palestinian, Israeli, and North American journalists, human rights advocates, and filmmakers, and we're part of Just Vision, which you can see the mission statement in front of you. We generate awareness and support for Palestinians and Israelis working nonviolently to resolve the conflict and end the occupation. And the reason why Just Vision emerged was because while the militant actions and militarism were receiving front-page headlines on a daily basis, particularly during the height of the Second Intifada, the people working behind the scenes quietly in their communities in order to effect change in ways that were not sensational were vastly underreported on. They were invisible to their own communities, and they were invisible abroad. And so our work is to try to surface their actions and their stories so that they have more leverage, so that they are more effective in their work. They have access to greater communities of support, and that's really why Just Vision was formed. So I wanted to just walk you through some of the tools that we have available for you, and also to let you know that our team is available to work with you as should you choose to adopt them within your own frameworks. We do have staff, both Palestinian and Israeli, who are available, and American, to help to integrate. So just a little bit of background as to why we use the tools that we use. We not only create feature-length documentary films, we also work with short film formats and also with multimedia materials online. And the reason why we adopted this strategy was because we wanted to ensure that the people doing the courageous work on the ground could continue to work in their communities and in the field while their message was being spread to tens of thousands and at times millions of people. And film and multimedia are a really efficient way to do that. They also are, part of one of the oldest forms of communication, which is storytelling. And storytelling has a unique ability to allow people to put themselves in the shoes of the other, to visit and place themselves in places that they might not otherwise have access to. And sometimes it allows for cognitive dissonance, so that preconceived perspectives could get shaken when confronted with new information through story and through film. And so these are key reasons. And then, of course, the language issue, which is that unfortunately, in our media environment, there tends to be a default to the easiest English-speaking person or the easiest person one can find to interview that speaks the language of the given journalist. And sometimes the folks who are interviewed or featured or highlighted aren't always the most qualified or the most representative or the most active in the field. And so what we do is we actually go and interview Palestinian and Israeli nonviolence activists and peacebuilders in their own native tongues, and then translate their words to broader publics and subtitle their words so that you have access to individuals you might not otherwise know about. So here's this is a slide of a recent TED Talk that my colleague Julia Basha gave that you can check out online. But we're going to skip ahead a little bit to talk about some of the tools that are available. The first film that Just Vision created in 2006 is called Encounterpoint. And I'm not sure how many of you have seen it, but essentially it follows several Palestinian and Israeli civilians who've all lost loved ones as a result of the conflict or have lost something precious like their homes or their liberty or their community, and are trying to move their respective constituencies in the direction of ending the occupation and resolving the conflict. And the film follows them along the way and all of the difficulties that they face. And it is not easy, as you can see throughout the film. It's an hour-and-a-half film. But it includes a variety of individuals you might not otherwise imagine, including a former settler who decides to move his family into Israel proper because he has an epiphany and starts to understand the impact of his presence on Palestinian human rights and on the fabric of the communities there. And so there's some very unlikely interactions that occur, and that is something that is available for classroom use. We've developed screening guides and lesson plans and worked with educators in a variety of communities. It actually had broadcast on Al Arabiya in Arabic in its entirety, and the Israeli Education Ministry also used it for some of their teachers, and it's been used extensively in American classrooms and mosques, churches, synagogues. So that is a tool that's available for those who have access to Netflix. It is on Netflix, and scenes of it are available for free on our website in the watch section of Encounterpoint on justvision.org. Now, in the film, there are actually a number of interactions that I think would be especially fruitful for those of you who want to broach the subject and are not sure what the starting point should be. And I'll give you a couple of examples. There is an interaction in the film between this former settler and a Palestinian bereaved brother who had been in prison for many years, who has become a nonviolence advocate and activist. And they have an exchange that really begins a learning and soul-searching process for this former settler, and really understanding what dynamics of a ceasefire are like in the two societies. That for Israelis, a ceasefire means the absence of violence, and for Palestinians, a ceasefire may still means living under military occupation, and what those asymmetries look like. In another scene, two bereaved fathers, one Palestinian and one Israeli, tell their stories about how they lost their respective teenage daughters, and then they actually come together and meet in a specific format, and you see that meeting, and they're both quite powerful. So scenes like that can be taken in isolation are often ways to begin conversations, because it grounds and localizes the issue, and it brings it back to the people who are most directly affected by the context of the conflict and the occupation. So hearing their voices, and then having your constituencies, your congregants, your students put themselves in the shoes of these individuals can be a constructive entry point. So moving through, just to give you a sense of a few more tools, and then we'll really have the interactive component, which is the discussion. The second film that we've produced, which was mentioned earlier, is called Budrus. And that film emerged as we toured with Encounterpoint in 2006. In Israeli society, we would often get the question, where is a Palestinian Gandhi. And the follow-up statement was, if Palestinians adopted nonviolence, there would be peace. That was the operating assumption that we've heard over and over again. And we heard similar comments in the United States. In Palestinian society, people felt very strongly that they had tried nonviolence during the first Intifada and before, and that it didn't work, that nonviolence was not an effective strategy for achieving political goals. And so people were quite disheartened. And so we sought to try to challenge those misperceptions on all sides. And we did it by telling the true story of a village called Budrus, which is based in the West Bank. Budrus is a small agricultural village with about 1,500 people, and in 2003 it was really under threat. It was facing destruction because the Israeli government was planning to build their separation barrier, the wall, the fence, whatever terminology you use, through the village, and it was going to go through the cemetery. It was going to go right next to the school and would have been disastrous for the community. And they at first turned to the Palestinian Authority and didn't get the kind of support that they needed, and so they ended up, one individual named Ayed Morar ended up organizing the men in the village, and they did not have success or organizing nonviolently to protest the construction. And then his 15-year-old daughter, who you can see here in this poster, she went to her father and asked him where all the women are. And he, like a true community organizer, responded that if she wanted women to participate, she should go ahead and organize them. And she did. And so she actually brought women to the front lines. And she, between the women and the men, they were putting their bodies on the line in a nonviolent fashion, day in, day out. They started to be joined by international supporters as well as Israelis. Some important relationships were formed with Israeli activists. It was difficult because the Israeli border police was not responding with open arms the way that I think many people in the Israeli public had believed would be the case. And but in the end, this is the first instance in Palestinian history where they saved their village entirely through nonviolence and not through the intervention of any Supreme Court or any international political pressure. And so it's quite an uplifting story about the power of nonviolence and the power of unity across divides. You have the various political factions that come together, Fatah, Hamas. You've got Israelis and Palestinians coming together. And Iltizam says very clearly that until the demonstrations, the only Israelis she had known were soldiers and settlers. And her perception of Israelis was extremely negative. And then seeing people standing with her and putting their bodies on the line was quite transformative for her. So you see stereotypes being broken as this nonviolent movement gains steam. The film was released in 2009. We started at the Dubai International Film Festival, and it toured around the world. It won awards in Berlin and in Tribeca and in Jerusalem at the International Film Festival, and it's been shown all across the West Bank. It's been shown on Palestinian television and in a variety. I say this just to not to brag, but to indicate that it's had traction both within Israeli and Palestinian society. Channel 2 News did a segment on the film an hour before the final game of the World Cup, which is the most watched night on television in Israel. So we've gotten quite a bit of coverage with it. It also is available on DVD, and it's being distributed internationally by various companies, so it's quite widely available. It's an excellent tool for looking at a nonviolent movement in action, warts and all. So it's messy. You see at times the community sort of descending into stone throwing. There's some chaotic elements of it, the differences of opinion between different actors, the challenge with the border police, the perceptions of the border police officers in the face of this nonviolent movement. So you see quite a bit in the context of the film. And I actually went, and of course we showed the film in the village of Budrus itself, but I also went to the border police woman, the main protagonist from the border police, Yasmin Levy's home, and sat with her and actually showed her the film as well. And we're very, and she actually commented that she felt that it was fair. And so we understand that we're accountable to multiple audiences with all of the materials that we create. Budrus, a number of groups have created screening guides that accompany Budrus. They're all available for free on our website. And Budrus is just an example. Unfortunately, the situation on the ground is an incredibly difficult one. So whereas Budrus was a small success, there are communities facing similar threats that were not as fortunate and were not as successful. And so I think that for anybody who would want to ground the conversation in Budrus, it would be very important to then bring people to see where else similar challenges and struggles are taking place. I think there's some real ethical, wonderfully potent ethical questions that can be raised about what constitutes nonviolent, strategic, or principled. What are, the differences between various nonviolence movements? We see many of them historically. Some that renounce all forms of violence from a principled place, and some from a tactical place. And what are the differences? What are the faith traditions' approaches to nonviolence? We're working currently on a Muslim screening guide and a Jewish screening guide. We've worked with Churches for Middle East Peace on a screening guide and a number of other organizations. We're also inviting sermons as part of a faith portal for our website. So just for those who may be interested, we've been turning to faith leaders to ask them to write sermons about some of the themes that are highlighted in the film around freedom, around nonviolence, around peace, around confronting the other, around civic responsibility. And then the aim is to have those available for free for others on our site as inspiration. So if any of you are listening and are interested, we would very much welcome your participation. So moving along, if I could see the next slide, that would be great. An outgrowth of Budrus, because the events in Budrus happened a number of years ago. They happened in 2003, 2004, and it was something that had taken place and had a resolution. We were asked repeatedly as we toured with the film about what is happening on the ground today, and that led us to release a series of 4 short films that are available for free on our site about nonviolence activists, Israeli and Palestinian, in an East Jerusalem neighborhood called Shahada. So any of you can visit our site. You see the URL here. And you can see the stories of these 4 very different people who were moved to act, to get involved in nonviolent movements, to try to ensure that Palestinian residents of this neighborhood were not evicted from their homes. There is in the last couple of years, there has been a real threat to the fabric of this community, this and other East Jerusalem communities, by settler groups, and both Israelis and Palestinians who want to see a shared future for the city of Jerusalem are trying to prevent people from losing their homes. And so you can see those films on our site. And there are 8 of them. You can use 1, you can use 2, you can use only the women or only the men or only the Palestinians, only the Israelis, or the youth piece. There are many angles that you can take with them. They're meant to be modular and flexible for your particular needs. So now that's just a little bit of background. I'll tell you a little bit about our web tools as well, just so you know what is available for free. We've been trying for a number of years to really think through this question of what are the useful tools and conversation starters. Matt, if we can keep moving through the slides a little bit. And you can see these are just images of some of the places where we've been conducting conversations and workshops and facilitating engagement with different audiences. The last few slides that you've seen were from Israeli and Palestinian context, but we do this across America and beyond. We've done some events in Europe as well, and Brazil and beyond. So moving on to and Canada here. So let's go back one slide if that's possible. Thank you. Okay. One thing that has worked very well as a format is a workshop called Voices from the Field. And we've helped to distill some of these quotes to make it easy for you, but you can adapt this as you see fit. Essentially, what we've done on our website is to publish interviews, and you'll see in a few slides from now, about 80 interviews with Palestinian and Israeli nonviolence activists and peacebuilders, where we ask them about the work that they've done, the experiences they've had, the lessons they've learned, the challenges they face. And then in addition to being able to read the various interviews, we've categorized the themes that come up per interview in such a way that you can cross-reference all of the themes. So for example, you can see what all of our interviewees had to say about nonviolence, or about fear, or about oppression, or about hope. And one facilitation exercise that we developed was to take a cluster of themes. So let's say the themes I just mentioned, and pull from quotes from the interviewees on our site, and then essentially make them available for people to come in and to read the quotes and to absorb the different perspectives that are being featured, and then to add their own voices, to add their own perspectives, their own, whatever the themes are, hopes or fears or perceptions of peace or nonviolence, as a starting point for discussion, and then dividing up into smaller groups and sparking those conversations. And we find that so long as we're grounding it in the voices from the field, it really makes it easier for people to engage. And here's some more imagery, but let's move on. I just want to give you a sense. This is all just from our site, but moving along to, okay, so just so you know what is available in order to help spark these conversations. I mentioned the films, I mentioned the interviews. We have these educational facilitation resources. We also have a glossary of terms. Many people are nervous about terminology on this issue, and so we've had Jewish and Arab scholars helping us to craft a glossary of terms for, in this conflict, unfortunately, almost every term has multiple names and multiple interpretations. Jerusalem is called different things, and the wars have different names. And, as I mentioned before, the barrier is also known as the wall. It's also known as the fence and the security fence and the apartheid wall. I mean, there's a variety of ways that the different communities refer to these same events or locations. And so our glossary gives you access to all of the different ways that people regard these events and these developments, so that you have access to that broader context. So I encourage you to take a look. There's also a timeline, which is a subjective history based on what people think are the salient historical moments and personal moments that have shaped their understanding of the conflict and led them to get involved. If we can just back up a little bit, Matt, for a second. So here we go. Let's move forward one. Yeah, so here you can see that if you go to the Visionary Sector website, you can search all of our interviewees by nationality, religion, residence, by the language they speak, by their gender, or by the type of work that they do. Are they an educator? Are they environmentalists? Are they engaged in direct action? Are they human rights activists? And then you can search by themes. You can search by, there are all kinds of ways that you can look for voices from the field. I will say that each interview is different. Every person has vastly different views on this issue. These are all people who are committed to a nonviolent approach. They're also working in some fashion across the Green Line, and they are all locally based. But beyond that, you may read one interview and completely agree, and then read the next one and be very upset by it or completely disagree. So I do want to warn you that we treat our audiences as adults. We assume, that people are adults and that they can move from one to the next, and not presume that one interview is reflective of all. And so, there are some interviews that I love on the site and some that I have deep disagreements with, and I think that it's important for us to understand the field and the variations in the field, and just the multiplicity of voices and perspectives. And this is a growing and living resource, so every few weeks we add another voice to the mix. That's, and you can see the resource center here, so you can get a sense of the support materials, faith-based facilitation, education, screening guides, and primary sources. This is all available at justvision.org for free. We would love your feedback, so if there are things that you feel are missing or things that you'd like to know more about, as I mentioned, this is an evolving site. My colleague Shahada, she just landed in Jerusalem right now, but she is she is responsible for making sure that faith communities have what they need to be able to work on this important issue and to speak about and highlight and learn about nonviolence leaders and peace builders on the ground. So we'd love to hear from you. And that's essentially the kind of show and tell part. I'd love to jump in and now talk about your concerns. Here you have my contact information, our Twitter handles, my personal one and the Just Vision one, which is more active than mine, and how you can either sign up for our email list on our website or by text.
Great. Thank you, Ronit. So I'm hearing you say that you're prepared to just start a conversation and respond to questions at this point. Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay, so we have time for some questions. For those of you who may have joined us a little bit late, we've been listening to Ms. Ronit Avni, who's the founder and executive director of Just Vision. And I've already received a few questions. If you have questions, you can just type them into the box on your screen and they will pop up here where I can read them and then try and sort them out a little bit and give them to Ronit to respond to. So Ronit, I've got plenty of material. Let's begin with a fairly short question that may actually be a more complicated answer. The question that has come through is, what in your mind constitutes nonviolence in the Palestinian context? How do you determine what action or what activity is nonviolent and what isn't?
That's a great question. For us, well, so I'll say two things. I think the Palestinians that we highlight, when they say nonviolence, they are not seeking to cause harm. They are not seeking to kill. They're not seeking to maim. They are still, they may engage in direct action, so they may put their bodies on the line, but they are not. They're not going to pick up any weapons. They are not aiming to kill Israelis. That is not their intention. So that's what I mean when I say nonviolence. Now, there's an active debate in Palestinian society at the moment on this issue of stone throwing, and there are different interpretations about it. Palestinians generally see it as a symbol of rejection, and they generally see it as the sort of David and Goliath image of it's not in the face of this massive mechanized army that it's, stone is a way to indicate rejection and to try to keep the army out of people's homes and within, a stone's throw of their communities. For Israelis, they see them as weapons. They see them as something that can cause harm. The leadership of the nonviolence movements tend to discourage stone throwing, not necessarily from a principled place, but from a tactical one. In the film of Budrus, you do see a border police officer getting hit in the face with a stone, and you do see her getting injured. So, that's what I meant when I said warts and all. So that's something that is a perfect discussion point for your constituencies, that this is not a clean, it's not, it's messy. We saw in Egypt with the recent uprisings that they were generally regarded as nonviolent, although there was some stone throwing. With Martin Luther King Jr., he rejected stone throwing. One of the marches where stone throwing happened, he canceled it and had people redo the march when they were prepared not to throw stones. So there, you see variations of this historically in what people perceive to be different nonviolent movements, and it's a very valid question and one that is worthy of people grappling with. But I think the rejection of the use of arms, of weapons, the rejection of killing, I think is a major distinguishing factor.
That's, as you say, a conversation that goes on over long periods of time by all of the folks involved, I think. There's another one that's a little bit related to that question, and I'm really intrigued by what you might have to say about this one. Someone has written, I'm interested in the role of faith in nonviolence, especially Muslim nonviolence. And this person lifts up Egyptian Jadat Sayi as an example of that, and then raises a question in an interesting way that I'm particularly intrigued by. This person's asking, as we look for a Palestinian Gandhi, what role could faith make? And so I guess one of the ways I would ask that question is, from your perspective, are we looking for a Palestinian Gandhi? And then how does the role of nonviolence in Muslim tradition play into that?
These are great questions. You know, I think that question of are we looking for a Palestinian Gandhi is a really important one. I think we have a tendency to look for those charismatic, iconic, singular figures, the Mandela, the Gandhi, the MLK, when interestingly there are many nonviolence movements where there isn't necessarily that one unifier. I think of feminism as perhaps the greatest example of that, where you can't say that it's attributable to one woman and her charisma and her leadership. And I think in the Palestinian context that it's unclear to me at the moment that there will be one singular charismatic figure. I think that there are many leaders. I think in the civil rights movement, you know, as much as we all know MLK, MLK would not have been effective, you know, if there was not an Ella Baker, or if there was not a Diane Nash, if there were not, you know, the Freedom Riders, if there were not, you know, others that took initiative before the charismatic leaders were in the mix or in conjunction with their activism. So I think the quest to find a Gandhi it may take us a little bit off course. I think we should be looking for how to support nonviolent movements, how to make sure that they are more effective and more strategic and more focused and impactful, how to interpret nonviolence to be able to understand that nonviolence movements are inherently confrontational, and that was true with the lunch counter sit-ins, and that's true today as well, that they're necessarily meant to make people feel, whoever the target audience is, dissonance between their values, their self-perception, and their actions. So those are the things that I think we should be focusing on more than, you know, is there a Gandhi, is this person the Gandhi or not? In terms of the faith question, it's a great question. So Palestinians, and this may be very rudimentary for everyone, so forgive me, but just, you know, Palestinians are comprised of both Muslims and Christians. It's majority Muslim on the ground, but both Christians and Muslims have been active in nonviolent movements. In Budrus, it was certainly, you know, they self-define as a conservative Muslim village. You know, but faith wasn't the motivating force in Budrus. I think the existential threat that the community was facing was very much the mobilizing force. I think that there's always a role for faith to play in any of this, whether it's for good or for ill. Faith is currently playing a role on the ground, and so I think encouraging the nonviolent voices in both Israeli society and Palestinian society, encouraging civic courage, moral courage, is very important, and to do it through the faith lenses is critical. I think the big question is always, who are the trusted messengers who can foster and encourage that kind of moral courage and that kind of leadership within faith communities. Because, for instance, I would not be the person to go and speak to an ultra-Orthodox nationalist Israeli constituency. I'm not ultra-Orthodox, and I think as such I wouldn't be the trusted messenger to be able to deliver that. And you know, obviously I'm simplifying, and not everybody is you know, moved solely by you know, faith identities, but I think certainly for people who are more devout, it helps when the people that you trust and respect are delivering these kinds of messages.
So, Ronit, that's a great opening for another question that's come through, because as you lift up kind of your own experience and where that gives you credibility, or a question that all of us would need to ask as we go into this work, someone has written in to say, first of all, thank you. And one thing you should know, I think all of the listeners should know, is I'm told that this is a record for the number of people participating on the webinar series for the Parliament, which is just great. And this person is asking if you could just share a little bit about your own personal story and how you got interested in this work in the first place.
Sure, sure, absolutely. And thank you for the question. I think for this issue, it's important. So I have multiple identities. I am part Canadian, I'm part Israeli, I'm a recent American. My father and his family, so all of my father's side, are Israeli and live in Israel, and parts of my mother's family live in Israel. My formative years were spent in Canada in an expat Israeli community, you know, somewhat small and somewhat insular, well-intentioned community. I grew up very much the product of education about Israel and about Judaism. I went through a Jewish schooling my entire for all of my K through 12 or K through 11 in Montreal education, and then didn't think that I would have anything to do with this issue. I had grown up in an environment where, sadly, we had teachers that expressed some very problematic and at times, even racist commentary. It wasn't unusual to have teachers who would say things like, "A good Arab is a dead Arab," which is awful. And I knew that it was wrong, and of course my family doesn't share those views, but I grew up around those views and wanted to get away from them. I wasn't especially interested in engaging the issue. And then found my way, I think, like many people, in university. I ended up being dragged into a Middle Eastern studies class, not especially interested to pursue it, and then really was struck by the dissonance between the narratives that I had grown up with and the fact that my educators were unable to hold multiple complex narratives simultaneously. We're not able to hold the dissonant space between these narratives, and that's when I really became hooked, and ended up volunteering and interning with two human rights organizations in Israel, one called B'Tselem and one called the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel. I spent time going back and forth between my family in Israel and communities in the West Bank during the 90s, during the Oslo process. And that, for me, was the moment when I realized that in the late 90s, Israeli society was really thinking that the conflict was about to end. They were building the new airport, looking forward to the millennium, and thinking that this was over. And Palestinian society had lost total faith in the Oslo process. Their economic situation and their mobility situation and their freedoms had become really encroached upon, and life had become very difficult under Oslo. And so there was a total lack of faith in the process and in the prospects for real peace. And so that disconnect between communities that were just literally 15 kilometers apart from one another, I would move back and forth, and each had a very set thinking about what the other's worldview was. So each one had a logic model that was a perfect logic model about their own view and their own sense of the other's view, and it's just that logic model had nothing to do with the logic model that was being applied 15 kilometers away. And I think for me that was a turning point, that even though I was an insider-outsider, I had not served in the Army, but I felt that there was a translation role that needed to be played, not just by me, but by many. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done, and I think that was the moment that I realized that not everything had been tried, that there was a lot of room for improvement, and also that was a moment where I realized that the Oslo process was going to collapse badly, and I think I wasn't the only person that felt that way. Many of us on the in the field at the time understood that the Oslo process was going to collapse, and it was no surprise to us when it did. And I think a big takeaway for me was that civil society must be bought into a process. It's got to be a process that they can live, not just a process, an outcome that they can live with, that they can accept, that they feel respects their need for dignity and for freedom and for security in order for it to hold. And that was the genesis. Briefly, I ended up, for a number of years, I worked at a human rights organization called Witness, equipping human rights groups around the world with video cameras, training them to document violations, and working with them on their media strategy. And from Afghan women's groups before 9/11 to, refugee communities in West Africa to landmine victims and, many others all around the world. And when the Oslo process collapsed, and when September 11th happened, my office was just a couple of blocks away from the World Trade Center. I just felt that my backyard was burning, and that I needed to go back into this particular issue where I felt a responsibility as an Israeli citizen, and to focus. And that was really the beginning of Just Vision.
Wow, Ronit, I'm really, one of the things I'm really taken by or kind of taken in by as you talk is that ability to hold complex narratives and kind of translate between them and move back and forth between them. And so I'm going to ask you to stay kind of on a personal level for one more question.
Sure.
And could you just talk a little bit about whether or not you've felt a threat of being labeled anti-Semitic, and whether that's been an obstacle for you or how you've wrestled with it.
Right.
And then is there a way to kind of broaden that to a broader conversation about how other folks enter into this in a way that's healthy and appropriate and sensitive to the voices in different places?
That's a great question. So first of all, no, I've never been labeled anti-Semitic, and it would be very hard to label me anti-Semitic. I mean, I am an Israeli citizen. I am, a Jewish person. I am somebody who takes ritual quite seriously and heritage and culture and community quite seriously. That being said, I have real. I don't think that any government should get carte blanche anywhere in the world, and I'm not a flag-waving nationalist. I wasn't one in Canada, and I'm not. I think that we always have to pay attention to anybody who wields power, whether it's a local police or whether it's a government official, or I think that that's true anywhere. And I think that lots of good people can do really bad things, and to speak very simplistically. And so the idea that one can't critique a government for its behaviors, I think is just not an intellectually serious proposition. And I know that people push that proposition and try to label people in all kinds of ways. Anti-Semitism is a serious thing. It exists around the world. I've felt it, minimally compared to many others, so I feel privileged that way. But I think that legitimate critique of immoral behaviors, legitimate critique of behaviors that we disagree with, is fair game. And one of the reasons why we have materials that are grounded in voices from the field is precisely to hear that these criticisms aren't just external ones. They're coming internally from Israelis, they're coming internally from Palestinians, and that we need to support the people that reflect our values. And that's always the case. And sometimes that's really difficult. In totally separate context, when I worked with feminist journalists in Algeria and these Afghan women, before September 11th. And the argument always was that it's external, the agitators are external, that, feminism wasn't intrinsic to it, wasn't local, it wasn't coming from these women leaders. And that was completely false. That was some politically interested people trying to keep other people from exercising their rights and their needs. And so I rejected it in those contexts, and I think I'm fairly consistent in rejecting it in this one as well. I think for those people who are not, if you're coming at this and you're not Israeli and Jewish the way I am, it can be harder to enter into the conversation, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't enter into the conversation. I think it's important to enter into any new space with humility. I certainly have I have tremendous respect for the people on the ground doing the work that they're doing, and I feel like it's important to learn as much as possible. It's important to immerse ourselves in the perspectives and the discourses of the communities that are affected by this conflict if we're going to get involved and roll up our sleeves. But I also want to caution people not to think it's so complex or that you need a PhD before you can voice an opinion. We need more hands on deck with this issue. We need concerned moral voices to make sure that the dignity of the two societies is upheld. So I hope to just encourage you not to be, not to feel bullied or not to feel afraid, and to enter into community with other people that respect your, that reflect your values on this issue.
That's really great advice, particularly the piece on humility. And one of the things I would say after having seen Budrus with my family is that humility of kind of the decisions that were being made about how to craft that film. You could feel the humility coming through as you all allowed the different voices to be heard. So I'm really grateful for your ability to put words on what it is you're trying to do.
Thank you.
So let me move back toward the nonviolence question for just a moment, and then I want to circle back to some questions about how to do conversations here in the U.S. One other question that's come in the last few minutes is a question about how boycott, divestment, and sanction strategies are appropriately a part of nonviolence, or how they're not, from your perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a debate that's going on. You know, it is, for most of Palestinian society, they are behind this strategy. So I will say that it's a very popular movement in Palestinian society at the moment. You know, I think how people use their resources, you know, is, you know, certainly these strategies have been regarded as legitimate nonviolent strategies in other contexts historically. I think the real debate kicks in as to whether it's a strategic move or not. Is it going to encourage Israelis to change their behavior so that it ends the occupation and deals justly with Palestinian needs, or is it going to entrench the hardliners and kind of promote a bunker mentality where the existential fears of Israelis are really tapped, and by extension the Jewish communities are really tapped to feel that the world is sort of out to you know, that the world is not understanding of their needs and their existential concerns. And I think that's really where the debate lies for people who are sort of in this sector. We as an organization engage the Israeli public quite deliberately. We've got Israeli staff people, and we are reaching out to them about this issue, about nonviolence, strategic nonviolence, and the work that we're doing. But it's very delicate. So I mean, I can give you examples in practice of sort of how that's played out for us historically. It is a moving, live and fluid situation. So I can't tell you where we will stand in a year from now. You know, if the settlements continue to expand and the situation in Jerusalem becomes untenable, you know, we're going to evaluate this every step of the way. But to date, you know, someone like Ayad Morar, the main protagonist of Budrus, he would not come to a screening of the film of Budrus at the Jerusalem International Film Festival. First of all, the Israeli government won't give him a permit to get in. So that's, you know, number one in terms of the mobility issue and the occupation. But even if he were to have been able to receive a permit, I don't think he would come to an Israeli government-sponsored institution while that government is sponsoring the occupation. At the same time, we wanted to engage the Israeli public about the themes of Budrus precisely because they're not exposed to movements like Budrus and the ways that the border police were behaving in the face of this nonviolent movement. So we walk a very fine and delicate position. I don't know how the movement is going to affect, you know, is it going to produce more of a Cuba or an Iran in terms of the local situation, or is it going to produce something that is more like Montgomery? You know, it's not clear. You know, as I mentioned, most Palestinians are behind it. Most of the Jewish community is against it. And it certainly evokes a lot of, you know, it certainly touches upon an existential nerve for a lot of people.
Thank you. One of the questions that came in before we began the conversation today, kind of in anticipation, was from someone in Illinois who asked whether you have any suggestions for a community where Jewish and Muslim students have had some kind of false starts in trying to come together and there's fatigue. Do you have any thoughts about how they can kind of restart at this point?
That's such a great and important question. I think that, you know, I'm gonna broaden it a little bit beyond students, because I think students are a great microcosm of, you know, or school environments are a microcosm of a broader situation. You know, bringing communities together is really delicate, and if it's done badly, it can do more damage than not doing anything at all. And so I think that question of fatigue speaks to that. I think there's been, you know, I've certainly witnessed communities where people try to control the terms of the encounter so tightly that it becomes almost meaningless. So, for example, to say we're never going to talk about politics, or we're not going to deal with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or we're only going to focus on domestic issues, those are worthy efforts, and if both communities are in complete alignment and agreement, that can work very well. But if one community is itching to talk about this issue, or is very concerned about it, then I think the first thing is figuring out what are the needs of the two communities. I mean, that's sort of classic community organizing in any context, which is understanding the local needs of each community, understanding the terms and the conditions and the kind of environment in which they would want to come together. Like what are their deep needs and their deep concerns, you know, and then finding facilitators, trained professionals, making sure that there's a representative group that is taking the lead in developing the framework. So, for example, in our team, like our board, which I am accountable to, the board is mixed between Palestinian and other Arab. We've got Egyptian and we've got it's mostly Palestinian, but somebody based in Dubai, an Egyptian board member, and some Jewish board members, and I'm accountable to them. And our staff is a mixed staff, and our senior staff is a mixed staff. So, I would look twice if you have a situation where you have, let's say, either 5 Muslims and 1 Jew, or 5 Jews and 1 Muslim, or some configuration like that is planning an event or a panel or a speaker series. I would reconsider whether it makes sense to move forward if you can't get some healthy representation from the two communities in order to set up the framework, because the process in many ways is as important, if not more important, than the final outcome of the gathering.
I'm really struck by the similarities between that and our experience here in the community living traditions, and the constant effort that it takes to strive to have a genuine, a real number of folks in each of the 3 traditions that we're working with here, the Muslim, Jewish, and Christian, so that the conversations can happen in a way that's healthy. You're right. If we don't do that from the beginning, then there's not a lot of hope for the conversation as it plays out. Exactly.
And actually, I should say the following, which is on the ground between Israelis and Palestinians. This is very clear in the following way. Israelis tend to want to get together and get to know the other as individuals, and really spend time on kind of the individual personal interaction, and then ultimately maybe get to the political. And for Palestinians, it's not about whether the person they're talking to is a nice person or not. It's about whether they can get to their school or their hospital, or it's about the political and the structural. And so finding that mix where you're dealing with the structural, where you're dealing with the circumstances on the ground, but you're also debunking stereotypes and getting to know the other is critical, because otherwise, what is no longer working is dialogue for dialogue's sake. There was a lot of dialogue efforts that emerged in the 90s during the Oslo process, and they were all constructed with that Israeli default that I mentioned, which is really focused on the personal. And Palestinians got very burned, and they just said, forget it, we're done. Like we get together, we talk, we eat some hummus, and nothing changes, and we go home to our circumstances, and the Israelis go home and they feel better about themselves. And there was a lot of resentment from Palestinians about that. So I would say that you're seeing a real pendulum swing now, where for Palestinians they're saying, unless it involves direct action, unless you're there in the field, putting your body on the line with us, we're not interested. And I think for Israelis that's very hard to do, and there's a real disconnect between those sets of needs and those sets of demands.
Which is a great opening for a question that's come in that I'd love to hear your response to. Someone has asked if you could name some of the Israeli organizations that are working in nonviolent ways against the occupation that you think really do get it and understand that distinction you're talking about. And maybe I could link a second question that's come in, which is, if you were planning or giving advice to someone who's planning to spend time in Israel and Palestine, advice about what organizations to reach out to, do you have some thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So on our website, by the way, we do have a list of, I think, about 100 organizations that people can look at. The tricky thing about the organization question is that not everything that is really powerful is necessarily in the form of an organization. So, sometimes it's loose networks, sometimes it's villages, sometimes it's collectives. But in terms of organizations, Israeli organizations, which is what was asked previously, I would say Arik Asherman from Rabbis for Human Rights is often the person that is, 4 in the morning called, to come and to be supportive if a home is about to be demolished or a community is under threat. He often gets the call and often shows up. So I think RHR, Rabbis for Human Rights, has done some important work. The first Israelis to get in the field and join Palestinians in this kind of nonviolent direct action work is a group called the Anarchists Against the Wall. And I know that anarchist has a particular resonance, particularly here in the United States. It's got a certain resonance to it. It is an organization of, I don't even know if they're technically an organization, but those were the first Israelis that crossed over and really paved the way for building some trust between Israelis and Palestinians. They are seen as radical left within the Israeli public, so I don't want to mischaracterize them or misrepresent them. But they were, I think, like many nonviolent movements, you start with the students, you start with the young people, you often start with the people who are willing to take radical action, and then slowly you kind of bring the mainstream in. And I think that that's not different here than it is for other movements. But those were the folks that were there first, and they were there consistently. And as I mentioned separately, Arik and Rabbis for Human Rights are there fairly solidly. There are other groups that are, bringing people on tours of the region. And again, there's a wide range. There are clearinghouses, there are think tanks, there are organizations, there are people who may not be doing the direct action work, but they are doing behind-the-scenes work that's very important, whether it's around water issues, whether it's about education. So take a look on our site. We've got a very long list. And the idea, as far as I'm concerned, whatever door you walk through, if your lens is that you're passionate about education, or you're passionate about faith, or you're passionate about the environment, or about student organizing or human rights, whatever door you walk through, you then start to encounter the other dimensions of this conflict and the occupation and the struggles involved. And so I really am encouraging of people to just start somewhere, and and from there, you will be on a journey. And I just encourage you to keep, if you start with one organization or one person or one initiative, and it doesn't live up to your expectations, please keep going, because I think one of the sad developments, I think, when the Oslo process collapsed, is that sometimes if people have a romantic sense of what is coming, and I saw this with a lot of my Israeli community, where people had such a romanticized notion of the Oslo process and where it was going, that when it collapsed, there was such a pendulum swing the other way, and such a kind of an anger at the collapse, as opposed to going in with our eyes open that this is messy, that people will disappoint. There's no, there's no noble victim. There are people, and there's some wonderful, courageous, inspiring people, and there's some really awful and corrupt and dysfunctional people, and they may be in the nonviolent movements as much as they are in the settlements or in the militant groups. So I don't think we should peg our hopes on any particular personalities. I think it's about the ethics and about opportunity and about moral commitments, and so I just want to really encourage people to keep going.
We've got only a minute or two left, and as usual, you've kind of handed me the last question that I was hoping to go to, which is a question about hope. And I just want to lead into this one with a personal reflection. I had the good fortune in early December to spend a week in Bethlehem with Christian Palestinian leaders and Christian leaders from around the world, spending the time talking about the occupation and what we do to where we go from here. And Mitri Raheb, the director of the DR Foundation, gave a talk that just totally blew me out of the water, in which he reflected on the difference between optimism and hope. And he said, no reasonable person who understands what's really going on, and certainly no Palestinian, can be optimistic at this point. There's no reason for optimism, and yet still we are called to be hopeful people. And it was a very, very powerful way of presenting that set of questions. I wonder if you have thoughts about where hope comes from at this point.
Oh, that's a good question. I think hope to me comes from a sense of history. It comes from looking at other movements that seem to be even more intractable and yet have been resolved. I mean, no one would have predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union. No one would have predicted that Germany and France would become this, and England, would have the relations that they do today. No one would have predicted the fall of the apartheid regime, or that, an African American would be elected president of the United States within the lifetime of the civil rights activists who had known Jim Crow. And I'm not creating parallels between any of these things, but these historical developments are beyond our imagination often, and yet they happen. I think feminism is such an incredible example of how we've taken thousands of years of social interactions and shifted them. So I think history has a way of surprising us, I also think that the world is aligning around the understanding that these two societies are not going anywhere. So what the political contours of a final agreement will look like may shift, but the idea that one cannot cast out the other, one cannot vanquish the other, I think that that's really become internalized even within Israeli and Palestinian majorities. Even if violence and settlement and occupation continue, I think the idea that the other one is going to somehow disappear is gone, and that's that's a shift from a few decades ago, where even the very recognition, let's say, of Palestinian nationhood was denied. I mean, Newt Gingrich just articulated this a number of weeks ago, but most people have moved past that. And I think the same is true in Palestinian society, that there is a broad recognition that the millions of Israelis are not going to be leaving the region. So I am hopeful. Not in the short term. I think that this is a marathon. This is not a sprint. But I am feeling a sense of urgency with that sense of hope, that this is a critical time, that the situation requires more of us paying attention and getting involved, but that there are reasons to be hopeful.
Well, Ronit Avni, I want to thank you for the time this morning, but even more, I thank you on behalf of all of us who have been listening for your work in the community and in the world, and for the ways that you've inspired so many of us to do more work because of the work that you've done. And I want to suggest to the organizers of the Parliament webinar series that this is a topic where we could have gone on for another hour today. I've got at least a dozen more questions lined up here that I didn't get to, and this is clearly something we need lots of conversation about. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much to all of you.
And I'll just go on and say that there will be the next webinar will take place on Wednesday, February 8th. It will be titled Contemplatives in Conversation, Sufi and Christian Perspectives, with Nahid Anga and Daniel Wolpert. We also invite you to stay connected to the interreligious movement through our email newsletter and by visiting our social network at peacenext.org. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available on our website within the next few days if you'd like to review it or share it with others. Finally, the vision of the Council for a Parliament of the World's Religions is of a more just, peaceful, and sustainable world. The Council works to cultivate harmony among the world's religious and spiritual communities and to foster their engagement with the world and its guiding institutions. For years, the Council has creatively and concretely worked to link the interreligious movement from the local to the global. And we send our thanks to all of you who are doing your own part for a better world. So once again, on behalf of the Council, thank you all for joining us today. Have a good week.